Whenever you set out to do something for God, you must make sure of your personal standing with God. No matter how important the mission may be, no matter how called you are, how anointed you are, or how equipped you are, you must make sure that you have addressed issues in your own life. This is part three of how to deal and how God deals with, rather, stubborn and hard hearted people. What you need to know about them. We have Exodus chapter 7 through 11 as our key verses here. Here we find that God, being a covenant God, remembered his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he would be their God, that he would be their deliverer. When Israel, the descendants, being the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the people you see now as Israel, a nation, but as the original covenant people of God, when they found themselves in a period of prolonged hardship and suffering, God acted to relieve that suffering. He wanted to reclaim his people as his own. He wanted to deliver them from suffering and oppression. So he decided to send a man with no qualities that we would recommend and choose and select, a man who had made mistakes, a man who was, as a matter of fact, on the run. When the people who were looking for him for what he did had died, and after he had served a 40-year stretch in the wilderness, a stretch of hardship, because remember, one morning he woke up in a palace, and within 72 hours, he was on the run, finally settling in a land called Midian. Think of this, from opulence to bitterness, because Midian means bitter. 40 years he lived a life of a laborer. Nothing suggests to us that God would call him, Moses, original Moshe, because he was drawn from the water, a man whose very existence was miraculous, because when there was an executive order that all children would be killed because the king of Egypt feared that there would be so many of them that they would actually take over and become dominant over the indigenous population of Egypt. So he issued this executive order death warrant to all children, and we think that they were 3 years old and under. So in order to save her child, his mother placed him in a makeshift raft and pushed him downriver in the crocodile-inhabited Nile River. The crocodiles could have easily snatched him out of the water, but God was superintending and overseeing his flight down his ship, his voyage down until he was spotted by a woman who raised him as her own daughter, ultimately making him the adopted grandson of Pharaoh. However, he committed a crime, as we know, and he was on the run. And now here he is, being sent back to their very land of Egypt 80 years later, 80 years later, as an envoy of God. God called him, commissioned him, and equipped him, and told him that he would actually have authority over the king of Israel, Egypt. He gave him miraculous signs to show that he was with him and that he, Moses, would have power to be successful because God was sending him. Make sure when you go somewhere to say something to somebody, God has sent you, God has called you, equipped you, commissioned you. On the way, however, God confronts Moses, and he has him in what the expositors and the original language says, he put Moses in a place where he was nearly in a death grip. Moses would have died that very night. And why was that? Because while going out to deliver God's message to the world to save people, Moses had omitted to do what God required him to do in his own home. Circumcision was the identifying sign of the covenant. Moses was supposed to have circumcised his son. Circumcising was a sign of faith. The rite in of itself conferred no spiritual privilege on a person, but it reminded a person for life that there was a relationship with the living God. This means that Moses was to transfer his faith down to his children. He wasn't to let his children grow up and be raised by society, culture, and trends. He was to let those children know, his sons know, that they were the people of God. Moses didn't do that. And because he did not exercise that tradition, that calling, that obligation on his son, God was going to cut him off. Now notice what's going on there. Because he did not cut off the foreskin of his son as a sign of the covenant, God was going to take him out for abridging the covenant. So let's make sure that whenever we decide and know for sure, certainly without doubt, that God is equipping, and commission us to do something, to go speak truth to power, to go liberate people, to go set people free. Listen, Moses was placed in the center of human history in his time. God chose him to be a part of a significant course of events that we now talk about. We still know about the Red Sea. That's how significant God made that man. But it would all have been a different story. Yes, God would have still delivered his people. But it would have been a different story for Moses because he didn't carry out the covenant with his own household. Make sure that you have done what God requires of you, especially in your home, before you go out to do something for God with others. Before you say, "Thus saith the Lord," you must make sure you did what the Lord said. Now, "Thus saith the Lord," at the time, of course, it wasn't thus, but it was a common saying amongst people who were diviners. So Pharaoh would have heard that as speech from God. He just didn't know what God was. Moses had that awesome task, that awesome privilege, that awesome elevation among human beings, being the spokesperson for the living God at his time. Yes, you can have position with God. You can be appointed by God, anointed by God, and even authenticated by God. But yet you can still be at risk because you didn't follow all the steps. And God is concerned about our homes and our children. Not just what we do in the world and what we do for others, but we must first be ministers in our own homes to carry out the covenant and transfer the faith to our children and exercise the faith in our homes. Later on, Moses' understudy and protege, Joshua would say, "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Even it says in Exodus that while Moses was in the temple, in the tabernacle, every man worshiped God at the door of his own home. So make sure that you've done what the Lord has called you to do in your home regarding faith. Therefore, you will not be in jeopardy with God